The forsaken places of history, ominous and mysterious. The British Empire, once the largest empire on Earth, protected by the Royal Navy for 3 centuries. Then, the empire dissolved, leaving a weighty legacy and a yearning for former glory. Once the Royal Navy's pride, the world's best hospital suddenly became too costly. Haslar.
People look at it and they think it costs major amounts of money, and it's essentially scrap now.
A Caribbean paradise hit by natural disaster is hoping for help from their former colonial rulers. Plymouth on Montserrat.
We were not going back to Plymouth. Plymouth is gone.
The first British colony at the end of the world, abandoned, depopulated. Maraschine, Newfoundland.
We were the last family to live over here 6 weeks by ourselves. That was it.
Places full of personal memories.
That's the only time I thought I want to go home.
Wars have been fought at sea for thousands of years. The enemy doesn't pose the only threat. Storms, hunger, thirst, and disease play their part as well. In the 18th century, the British forces declared war on these threats and built a unique naval hospital. The Royal Hospital Haslar.
The main aspect of the day in the 18th century, health-wise for sailors, was that more were dying from disease and injury than actually being sort of killed at sea by cannonball and shot. My name is Eric Burbeck, and I joined Haslar in September of 1964.
The British Admiralty acquired the land in 1745. It cost £100,000 to build, twice the price of the Admiralty's headquarters in London. Opened in 1753, it was Europe's biggest brick building. It was built to nurse sailors back to health and to save costs.
If you were in British waters, the captain would give you a few pennies, but you'd have probably fallen into the local tavern, you'd have drunk yourself to death or died from your disease in the, within a couple of days. Haslar did change that.
Haslar lies on a peninsula in the south of England. The hospital was once surrounded by a high wall complete with watchtowers. Many of the sailors were conscripted by force and would attempt to desert at the earliest opportunity. Patients were brought to the hospital by boat. Upon arrival, a strict procedure was followed, but like today, it could take some time before a doctor was available.
Here we are in the arcade, which was the main reception area for the wounded and injured.
After the decisive sea battle against Napoleon in 1805, several thousand wounded were brought to Haslar.
Following the Battle of Trafalgar, all in one day they discharged their sick and even dying, who were brought on handcarts from the port up through the main gate, in through these doors, and here into the arcade, and taken off the handcarts and laid on the stones to await to be seen by the physicians and the surgeons. They bled their lifeblood into these very stones.
Trafalgar is synonymous with the Navy's glorious victory over Napoleon. Nonetheless, thousands are wounded. Soldier or sailor, they are patched up here at Haslar in order to be sent back to war. Fatalities from illness or lack of hygiene are common.
We're in the paddock. It's known as the paddock, but it was initially the burial ground for Haslar. This area, which is some 9 acres in size, is estimated through the work by forensic archaeologists over the last 10 to 15 years, that there is some 20,000 plus bodies buried here.
The dead are not all British. They lie shoulder to shoulder with Russians, Ottomans, French, as well as soldiers from the British colonies. They died after Waterloo, in the Crimean War, or because of hundreds of other battles.
And in fact, in 1 or 2 coffins, there was more than one body. And extra leg or arm from an amputation, which caused quite a bit of interest when we first started to work with the archaeological teams.
From the outset, Haslar Hospital stands for the modernization of medicine. Here's where scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, is first remedied, by administering fruit and vegetables. Haslar is also home to England's first blood bank, but for a long time, operations remained somewhat crude.
If you had or needed surgery, your surgery took place in your bed in the ward or in a room at the end of the ward, which your colleagues and the other patients could hear your screams and cries. The first operating theatre opened in 1910.
Medical progress lowers the death rate in the 19th and 20th centuries. Life expectancy, as well as the social status of naval officers and crews, were on the rise. The empire grows and reaches its peak dimensions in 1920. In all of history, there has never been a vaster empire or one with more subjects. But the glamour of the famous naval hospital is beginning to fade. When the Normandy landings are planned in 1944, Haslar no longer plays a part. In the wake of the victory over Hitler, Britain has no further need of the venerable hospital.
It began to be realized that Haslar, being nearly 4 centuries in service, was not lending itself very well to being transformed to deal with modern-day casualties of war. They needed a more central hospital of excellence of the period, and it began to actually sign the death knell for Haslar itself.
Eric Burbeck, technical director of Haslar for 32 years, retired in 1996. Newfoundland, Canada today. Over 1,000 years ago, the Vikings were the first Europeans to reach America, but they didn't stay. In 1583, Newfoundland is claimed by England under Queen Elizabeth I. The islands are given the name of newly found land, which in turn becomes Newfoundland. It is the foundation stone of the subsequent empire, but there are few riches to be had on these bare, cold rocks in the northern Atlantic.
We did the very basic things. It was very normal, but lots to do, and much of it closely related to being people born by the sea. My name is Raymond Joseph Hann, born April the 7th, 1950, in beautiful Mirachine, on Mirachine Island, in Newfoundland's far greater bay.
Only the turbulent seas around Newfoundland kindle desire with their rich bounty of fish. Cod is particularly abundant, so much so that people believed that these fishing grounds would never dry up, the basis of the livelihoods of many.
Very few people didn't make their living from the sea. Almost exclusively, everybody had their own boat. This area of the plant, back in the day, was used to salt the fish after it was processed on the wharf. It would be landed on the wharf, split, and washed and brought in here. And all of this area here was filled from floor to ceiling with salt codfish.
Newfoundland becomes part of Canada in 1949.
Ottawa, and the Governor-General, Lord Alexander, meets Prime Minister Saint-Laurent to sign the bill ratifying the agreement to bring Newfoundland into the Canadian Commonwealth. The vast addition of Newfoundland and its dependency Labrador brings 325,000 new citizens under the Canadian flag.
Compared to the rest of Canada, Newfoundland was very much behind the time. Many still lived as in the 19th century. A program of modernization is launched to tackle that. The era of industrialized fishing has begun, with frozen fish, large trawlers, and fewer crew.
But in 1949, we marginally voted to become a part of Canada. That might have set the wheels in motion for this modernization agenda that Joey Smallwood and the government of the day had embarked on, because there was no doubt that, we were behind in this province in terms of any kind of modernization, and we had a lot of catching up to do.
Moving house in Newfoundland can cause a lot of excitement. One reason is that here, moving house means just that, taking the old homestead away, lock, stock, and barrel, and putting it somewhere else.
The government attempts to relocate inhabitants of remote villages into so-called growth areas. Incentives are modern streets, schools, and healthcare. Things that don't exist in remoter parts of the land.
The head of the household would be paid $1,000, and there would be $200 for every other dependent in the family. So my father left all his property, land, buildings, shops, store loft, stage, wharves, and he got $3,400. And it wasn't enough to buy an outhouse where we moved, quite frankly.
Between 1957 and 1975, more than 300 villages are abandoned, and 30,000 people are relocated, more than 10% of the population. For many, an enduring trauma.
We left Mirasheen on October the 9th, 1968. We were the last family to live. We were here 6 weeks by ourselves. On the last day, and my father said to me, "Ray boy, you better go up and shut down the power and close the door and see that everything is okay." So I went up and turned off the switches, shut down the generator, and closed the door and walked away. Mirasheen was left to the spirits. That was it.
Today, Ray is Mirasheen's unofficial mayor and guardian of remembrances for the next generations. Up until the 20th century, more than a dozen Caribbean islands were part of the British Empire. On her visit to the region in 1966, Queen Elizabeth II stopped over in Montserrat. The island is still a so-called overseas territory of the British Crown. The Royal Navy remains active here to this day.
British battleships perform various roles. Sometimes they would do community projects, but as a significant part of it, we did a lot of simulation exercises from a disaster or emergency management standpoint. I'm Norman Castle. I'm a local businessman involved in many different things, in addition to being a tour operator.
In the Caribbean, catastrophe prevention is mainly called for during the hurricane season. Montserrat is hit in 1989. Hurricane Hugo devastated the capital, Plymouth. More than 90% of buildings are destroyed.
Just when everybody was saying that, well, you know, it would take us 10, 20 years to rebuild, we were really back on track within about 2 years.
Montserrat's capital is resurrected to new splendor with the help of British aid. But storms are not the island's only worry. The Soufriere Hills volcano lies in its south.
My father very often took us to the Soufriere, and we would carry eggs and cook them on a string or piece of cloth, and sometimes we put our hands where the warm water was coming out.
Montserrat is part of the Lesser Antilles and of volcanic origin.
The Lesser Antilles are a volcanic island arc. These arcs mainly come about in zones of subduction, which means that one plate is pushed under another. In this case, the Atlantic Ocean floor slides under the Caribbean plate, and deep down in the earth it is very hot, which can cause fusing, and beyond the subduction plate confines, this can create volcanoes that in turn bring about such island arcs.
As part of the reconstruction after Hurricane Hugo, the island's airport is to be expanded. It lies at the foot of the dormant volcano.
They found these Indians that had died in these contorted positions. And the archaeologists told us at the time, these people were killed from pyroclastic flows. And it was interesting to see it was so similar in terms of this contorted fetal position, which even when we look at photographs from Pompeii and other similar type volcanoes, that it's just so similar.
Life on Montserrat continues as before. In its 500 years of colonial history, the volcano has never erupted.
Communal recollection often forgets an eruption, and so the idea of an eruption is not in people's heads, which is why there is little fear of or respect for the volcano.
But on July 18th, 1995, Soufriere Hills comes back to life. Back in the south of England and the former naval hospital Haslar. Tens of thousands of British sailors were treated here. Doctors at Haslar saved thousands of lives. Some of the families have been in the Navy for generations.
My brother was in the Navy, my dad had been Navy. It just seemed a natural choice. I'd always wanted to go into nursing, and I wanted to travel, so I joined both together. Hello, I'm Marion Houghton. I started at Haslar in 1974. I did 22 years as a nurse in Queen Alexandra's Royal Naval Nursing Service.
Almost everything at Haslar is based on proud British traditions. The first British Nurses Association is formed in 1883. Queen Consort Alexandra becomes patron of nursing in 1902, and the service is renamed in her honor.
It was the first time I'd ever left home, and I wasn't sure whether I'd made the right decision.
Marion Houghton trained as a urology nurse. This is her first time back at Haslar since its closure.
The bed used to be all the way down, and that used to be one of the nurses' stations was there with all the computers where the nurses used to sit and write up patients' notes, telephone other wards. And of course, because it was a Nightingale ward, from here you could see all your patients.
Florence Nightingale is known as the inventor of modern nursing. She introduced new hygiene guidelines during the Crimean War and was able to reduce the mortality rate among the wounded from 42 to 2%. Even today, open wards are known as Nightingale wards. All these openly visible beds presented Marion, who was only 18 at the time, with a delicate dilemma. She had to shave a young sailor's genitals in preparation for an operation.
I was a very new probationary nurse, and the staff nurse had asked me to go and shave a gentleman. Now, I'd never seen a gentleman from the waist down, and I was mortified. And I think I was so red-faced, and he was very red-faced. But luckily, the sister came in and rescued me and said, OK, go away, I'll do this. But that was really... I look back now and I think how silly it was, but then it was pretty...
At the end of the Second World War, the Empire is lost, and the Navy was grieving over some of their lost status.
But today, as for 350 years, the bulwark of England's defense is His Majesty's Navy. And if a new war comes to Britain, she will again depend upon the ships of this Navy to keep the sea lanes open for the arms, the raw materials, and the food which she must import if the British Empire is to survive.
During the Cold War, the Navy barely sees any action until 1982. In the spring, nurses are recruited for service on the Falkland Islands.
Well, I thought the Falklands was in Scotland. I'd never heard of this place before. I don't think any of us had. We said, yeah, that's fine, we'll go. As you do, but very, you know. And we thought this was going to be a bit of a jolly, as you do. And going down to the Falklands, that was lovely. It was sunshine. You know, we were busy getting wards together, but we honestly thought that time we get down there, we'll be turned around and sent home because it'll all be over. But it wasn't.
The Falkland Islands are a largely disregarded remnant of the British Empire. They host more sheep than people. Argentina, then a military dictatorship, laid claim to the islands in the southern Atlantic. On April 2nd, 1982, Argentinian troops occupied the islands. Great Britain readies its warships to take the islands back. Marion Houghton was serving on the SS Uganda. Argentina possessed modern missiles and deployed them against the British.
And then the HMS Sheffield was sunk. And that's when reality hit home, when we got the casualties from HMS Sheffield.
The destroyer HMS Sheffield was hit by an Argentinian Exocet missile and caught fire. 20 seamen died, 24 are wounded.
Certain people died on the Sheffield. And I think that's when we really realised that this was for real. And it wasn't just a jolly, and it lasted 4 months.
The British are the far superior force, but they still suffer losses. Marion Houghton usually works in urology. In the southern Atlantic, she experiences the life of a nurse in a war.
I'd just finished my duty, but we got called back. And I always remember walking past, we had a little kitchen on the way to this ward. And I remember saying to my colleague, God, someone's burnt the toast tonight. But it wasn't toast. And you open these two doors and you're just faced with all these burnt faces. And that's the only time I thought, I want to go home. I don't want to be here.
Great Britain retook the Falklands. The returning troops, among them Marion Houghton, are greeted as heroes. She works at Haslar until her retirement. Newfoundland is of strategic rather than economic importance to the empire. It is here that during the Second World War, the vital passage of US convoys across the Atlantic is secured, by ship or by plane. Newfoundland is home to Gander Airport, the world's largest for a while. US dollars flood into Newfoundland. US soldiers bring the American way of life with them, a challenge for the conservative and deeply religious population.
While we were at the college, Littledale College in St. John's, Father Lewis from here came in recruiting for teachers from Mirasheen. And my friend was sat behind me in class, right? So I turned around to her and I said, let's go. My name is Doreen Ennis, and I was a former teacher here in Mirasheen, and I live in Placentia, Newfoundland now.
Doreen and her friend take a ship to Mirasheen.
She looked out through the windows, and all you could see was rock. And she said, that's not land, she said. I said, well, that's Mirasheen, that's just one big rock, right?
Little remains of the school Doreen Ennis once taught at.
We're coming now to the site of the school. All you see now is the foundation. This was our front door. That was my classroom right there. Right there, my classroom.
While Newfoundland's per capita income increases once it becomes Canadian, it still remains well below the North American average. From 1957 to 1971, 3,000 to 4,000 inhabitants leave Newfoundland every year. Doreen Ennis and her fiancé are among those who leave.
George was out of the service and he was living here. And I had planned to go to Toronto with my mom because I had brothers living up there. And George said to me, perhaps the two of us should go to Toronto. So we went to Toronto. We got married in Toronto. And we stayed there for a year. Both of us worked. I didn't care much for it. And so we decided to come home.
But the authorities want to abandon Mirasheen and other villages. Priests are recalled. Public services shut down. Even the ferry service that connects remote communities with the mainland is set to cease.
The whole way of life changed. I don't know how people got over it, especially the older people. And had they stayed here, they would have had to continue on making a comfortable living. It was still the stupidest thing that ever happened, that resettlement.
Doreen spends every summer on the island. This rock in the northern Atlantic is still her home. The HMS Victory, flagship of the Royal Navy, victorious at Trafalgar. And the then newest submarines are moored near the Royal Hospital Haslar. The Empire, the Navy, and the Crown are fused in history. Queen Elizabeth II visits the famous naval hospital in 1959.
Among those who awaited the Queen on the playing fields of the Royal Naval Hospital Haslar were the submarine Old Comrade.
Haslar's glory days are already over at this point. To maximize occupancy, civilian patients are being accepted. One of them is Jeff O'Neill.
If you went to your GP with a problem, there was no, what hospital shall we send the patient to? It was always Haslar, because Haslar had specialists in every field you could possibly think of. My name's Honorary Alderman Jeff O'Neill. I'm a former Mayor of Gospel. I've been associated with Haslar Hospital since some 55 years ago now.
Haslar has stood for medical progress in the Royal Navy since 1753. Warfare benefited medicine, as it caused many injuries that required inventive treatments and cures. But with the decline of the empire in the 20th century, Haslar's role became less prominent.
Haslar is a military hospital, a Royal Naval Hospital, Haslar. So you know you're going into a military hospital. And you can tell that because it's self-evident of the discipline that is in the hospital, the dress that the nurses and the officers wear. You know that what level they are, what their skills are.
In the second half of the 20th century, more and more British colonies gained their independence. The empire is shrinking, and the Royal Navy's significance is diminishing as well. Haslar can only remain viable by also accepting civilian patients.
As surgery has changed and the approach to surgery and patient care changed and nursing care, it increased. But from D-Day, between D-Day and the Falklands, one of the biggest changes was in 1948 when the National Health Service was provided with 84 beds in the hospital for just civilian patients.
Great Britain has had a National Health Service since 1946. A portion of Haslar is now reserved for patients from the region.
It came very suddenly and almost out of the blue. I had severe chest pains and I couldn't breathe. And my wife rang for an ambulance. I was initially very scared when I was in the ambulance and I was brought here.
Haslar remains a Royal Navy institution, but there are just not enough wounded soldiers to fill such a large hospital. Increasingly, Haslar treats civilians and becomes an integral part of the city of Gosport.
Oh, it was fundamentally important to us. It was important for the economy. It was important for the plot. It played in Gosport, all the staff. And of course, it was important for the care that they gave to. There were so many specialists in different fields at the hospital, they could really cater for every department.
But that's all in the past. Nowadays, patients are treated in the neighboring city of Portsmouth.
This is a warship Liverpool with the Montserrat volcano shipping warning.
A British dependent territory is in trouble. A British warship has been sent to the scene. The presence of HMS Liverpool in the waters off Montserrat is symbolic of Britain's commitment to this island, but more than that, its crew have come to work.
On the Caribbean island of Montserrat, an impending natural disaster is looming, one that not even the military can stop. The Soufriere Hills volcano is threatening Montserrat and especially the capital city of Plymouth.
We were told that there was a 5% chance of Plymouth being inundated by volcanic activity. I remember us discussing this thing and saying, well, 5% is a very low probability. But the bottom line was, if even it was 1% of a chance, there's still a possibility. And unfortunately, that was what happened with Plymouth.
On July 18th in 1995, Soufriere Hills awakens from a deceptive sleep.
It started out initially with us hearing these sounds of jet engines coming from the hills. When we started getting ash, little speckles of black ash. And that's when someone started saying, well, this must be volcano related.
Plymouth is home to 4,000 of the island's 12,000 inhabitants. At the first signs, the capital's inhabitants are evacuated to safety. As yet, no one has given up on the city or the island, but the actual eruption has not even begun.
The eruption of Soufriere Hills was preceded by increased earthquake activity. Finally, new magma reached the surface and a very typical dome eruption developed. Since more and more magma kept pushing up and gases also increased the pressure, Soufriere Hills showed several phases of the dome rising and then collapsing again, creating pyroclastic flows.
A mixture of heated gases, dust and debris shoots into the valley.
The first time I had some fear was when I was driving in the Eastern Corridor, an area that we were not supposed to be. And that was just like about 2 or 3 days, folks got killed. And a pyroclastic flow passed me in the valley section going down. And of course, I started praying.
Thousands of tons of superheated rocks speed down the slopes.
Pyroclastic flows are a mixture of gases, ashes, and larger stone fragments. They are extremely hot, up to 1,000 degrees, and very fast, up to 200 kilometers per hour. This makes them highly destructive on impact of larger stone fragments because of their speed and their heat. Obviously, they are deadly for people, animals, and vegetation. They can even melt metals and buildings. Their biggest threat is that you cannot escape them fast enough.
Several dozen of these pyroclastic flows shoot down the volcano. Capital city Plymouth is buried under debris and ashes. Luckily, the south of the island had already been evacuated.
This government headquarters was struck by a pyroclastic flow, and it was really a very it was a memorable moment, but very distinctive in the sense that there was a good crowd, but it was so quiet because it's at that point people realized we were not going back to Plymouth. Plymouth is gone.
In spite of the timely evacuation, 19 people die because they return to the prohibited area. New eruptions and mudslides caused by rainfalls bury Plymouth under huge amounts of volcano ash. Today, large parts of the city are still covered by meter-thick layers.
If you look around, it's billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that litters this landscape. Well, used to litter this landscape because now most of it is buried. Although this causes severe economic loss, it also produces economic opportunity. So we can see some of the pumice, sand, and different types of material. This material has now spawned a very interesting sand mining industry. It is now a multi-million-dollar industry on the island.
Before the eruption, Montserrat had 12,000 inhabitants. Only 5,000 now remain. The economy has still not recovered in spite of the 30 million euros that London contributes annually.
It's still a very, 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 very beautiful island. And I want to see that maintained. I want to see the protection of our environment. It's critical. I just want a slow-moving, but very efficient-moving pace in my country. That's what I want to see for future Montserrat. But moreover, a quiet volcano.
The ocean off the northeast coast gives to the nation an abundant variety of seafood.
In places like Maraschino, cod fish is traditionally dried or salted before it's sold. But modern fishing boats can freeze the catch directly on board. Demand for salted cod is declining. The remaining fishermen can barely make ends meet. Two of the last remaining fishermen in Maraschine are Jared, also known as Carter, and Rita Pomeroy.
As far as I can remember, I'd say probably roughly around 200 years. My great-grandfather and my grandfather, my father, and I'm the last of the Pomeroy fishermen anyway, that in our bloodline. My name is Gerard Pomeroy. I'm an inshore harvester. I live in Maraschine, and that's where I'm going to die.
His wife also fishes professionally.
My name is Rita Pomeroy. I live on Maraschine Island, which I consider my home.
Queen Elizabeth visited Newfoundland in 1959. The former colony is now Canadian. It is independent, but still part of the Commonwealth, with the Queen as head of state. The abundant natural resources are proudly displayed, but this wealth is finite.
Here, just not biting. Feel on nibbling?
Yeah. The last few years out here, there's absolutely nothing. You have a job to get one to eat out of it. Whatever's after happening out here, I don't know.
Since the 1950s, large factory ships have decimated the cod. Trawlers catch up to 60 tons of fish per boat. Moreover, they only require a fraction of the manpower in comparison to net and line fishing. Securing a livelihood through small fishery in Newfoundland is gradually becoming impossible. In 1992, the Canadian government implemented the cod moratorium, totally banning cod fishing. An estimated 38,000 fishermen and factory workers lose their jobs. The moratorium was only meant to last for 2 years.
You can feel them nibbling, but they're not biting. They're probably too small to get on the hook. We have a lot of recruitment, very small fish, which is good for the future, but not good for us today.
I'll make another move. I move somewhere else.
Fishing is not easy. It's a very hard job. When the fishing is there, it's good. But when the cod is not plentiful, you don't make the wages that you need to survive for the next year. But all in all, it's still very exciting and very, very rewarding. Very good for your soul to be on the water, to be your own boss.
But since fish numbers have not recuperated sufficiently, the ban is still being partly upheld, making commercial fishery in Newfoundland a thing of the past. Under strict limitations, only very few fishing licenses are issued. They cost 10,000 Canadian dollars, a risky investment. Rita and Carter continue to take that risk. Nostalgic for times past, the good old day, even the British Navy knows that feeling. It was the world's mightiest navy for over 100 years. But during the second half of the 20th century, it dwindles down to a significantly smaller force. Cost saving is the buzzword, and the legendary naval hospital Haslar is no exception.
I was very young, 17. I came from Glasgow, the cold and dreary north. I thought a bit of world travel was just in order. But some glib recruiting chap told me, medic's the job for you, my lad. Did I have any kind of medical background before? Absolutely none. Hi, I'm Commander Bill Durning, Royal Navy retired, and I was the last military officer appointed to this hospital in 2009.
Haslar was a military hospital since 1753. It wasn't until 1948 that civilians were admitted, but the essence of Haslar has remained strictly military.
That's why they send you to Haslar, because the point of the training is not for me to work in a hospital, me to work in a ship, to deal with any emergencies that occur at sea or in an active operational military unit somewhere. But of course, hospitals are where the patients are, and hospitals are where the training takes place.
The core function of Haslar, the treatment of war wounded, is no longer really called for, and the Royal Navy is shrinking. In 1950, it still boasted 400 vessels, 12 aircraft carriers, 66 submarines, 280 destroyers and frigates. In 1970, only 130 vessels remain, and this number dips below 50 in 2004. Bill Durning becomes managing director of Haslar. He knows that the purely civilian future for his military hospital is not an option.
I never imagined it would ever close, and I never imagined it was close with me being the last military person ever to be appointed within the grounds of this hospital. That's something I'll carry. It's something that makes me a little unique.
In 2007, the prestigious hospital passes into the hands of the National Health Service. Just as neighboring Portsmouth is building a new modern clinic, Haslar closes its doors forever in July 2009.
I just then took the opportunity just to drive around and walk around the place for a last time, because I knew from that point on it would never be the same again.
The closure of Haslar with its inherent cost stirs criticism. Until the bitter end, the hospital had been kept up to date technologically. Much of the equipment is now redundant.
This is the part of the hospital where people get quite emotional about. This is the Department of Nuclear Medicine. People look at it and they think it costs major amounts of money and it was abandoned. It did cost major amounts of money, but with everything, technology lasts a briefest of time and it's now very old. But it was offered at, but there were no takers. So it's essentially scrap now.
An investor purchases Haslar's grounds and structures. Britain's historic naval hospital is being turned into flats. The southern location, the sturdy buildings, and not least its place in history, make for attractive properties.
And as you can see here, they're demolishing all the additions. The place now, what they'll use for it, it'll end up being accommodation. And once they've finished all of this, I wouldn't be able to afford to come and live here. It'd be so expensive.
On the Caribbean island of Montserrat, nothing will ever be the same either. In the aftermath of Soufri's Hill's eruption in 1997, 5 out of 6 inhabitants lose their homes. A then 14-year-old witnessed the catastrophe at close quarters.
I was at school. We heard the collapse. It was a very bright day, a very sunny day like today. You put your hand in front of your face and you couldn't see a thing. It was pitch black. Hi, my name is Vita Wade, and I am from Montserrat. I have lived through our volcano eruptions, and I have returned to Montserrat to be a part of its redevelopment.
The climax of the eruption takes place on June the 25th, 1997.
The deadliest eruption on this island for almost 400 years. Mount Soufriere has come to life once again, spewing ash and rock more than 5 miles up into the Caribbean skies. The very future of Montserrat as an inhabited island is now in the balance.
Vita Wade and her family are evacuated, but safety is relative.
We got into the car, I remember, and headed to near the hospital. And you could smell the burning on the island. You could smell the burning of the trees. I I saw my dad come home, and he was covered, he was white in ash, and he was shaken. He's a very strong, brave black man, and he was just shaking like a leaf. His foot was swollen, and he said that he had gotten injured. His car tire had caught fire, and his feet, as a result, as he jumped out of the car, caught fire.
Before the eruption, Montserrat had 12,000 inhabitants. Nearly 10,000 flee the island. The fact that fatalities are limited to 19 prompts some relief.
Plymouth, though it was completely destroyed, remains a positive example for the work of volcanologists. Because the eruption announced itself seismically, via smaller explosions on the surface, it was possible to warn people in advance and evacuate the city. On Montserrat, 6,000 people were relocated, and while their city was razed to the ground, we have relatively few fatalities to lament.
After the eruption, Montserrat's premier travels to London. His island is a British overseas territory and in need of support for reconstruction.
The Labour government of Britain remains fully committed to the viability of the future of the island of Montserrat. We are determined that those who leave the island will be able to do so if they wish to do so.
The mother country has been the destination for migrants from the Caribbean for generations. Vita Wade spends 10 years in Great Britain before returning to Montserrat.
My greatest wish for Montserrat is that our people don't have to leave to live, learn, or earn, and want to come back home. We value Montserrat, and we want to come back home as well to be part of its redevelopment.
Vita has formed a society that teaches children a conscientious approach to the environment. Montserrat's future is to be green. In the 20th century, history's largest empire is reduced to an average European power. Some former territories and colonies experience this change dramatically. The new freedom is not always fortuitous. Others, like Montserrat, retain close links to the mother country on a social and, out of necessity, also financial basis. In Great Britain, the loss of the empire causes some phantom pains. This feeling is particularly poignant in places of once greater glory.